The courtroom was filled with the usual noise and movement as people settled into their seats. It was just another day in a small town where justice was expected to be fair and equal for everyone. However, this day would turn into something that no one could have predicted. As the judge entered the room, her presence seemed calm but commanding. She was a black woman, dressed in professional attire, her gaze focused and steady as she prepared to begin the proceedings. She had worked hard to get to where she was and earned the respect of everyone who had ever crossed her path. Yet, today, her presence was being challenged, but not in the way most would expect. A police officer who had a history of being overly aggressive and having a bad reputation in town was also present in the courtroom. He wasn't there as a defendant, but rather as part of the security team. The officer was known for his sharp, often intimidating behavior, especially when dealing with people he didn't respect, and in his mind, it was clear that he didn't view the judge as an equal. When he first entered the room, he paid little attention to the woman who was already seated at the front. But the moment he made eye contact with her, there was a flash of arrogance in his gaze. He didn't recognize her at first. She was just another person in the courtroom, someone he assumed was probably there as part of the case, or perhaps someone with a less important role. The officer wasn't used to treating people with kindness or respect, unless they were in a position of power, and clearly he didn't think much of her. He looked down at her for a moment, sizing her up with judgmental eyes. His posture, stiff and almost confrontational, seemed to indicate that he wasn't about to treat her with any form of respect. His behavior was subtle at first, but as the minutes passed, it became clear to everyone around that he was uncomfortable and even hostile. A few people in the courtroom exchanged glances, sensing the tension building in the room. The woman, however, remained calm. She didn't react to the officer's behavior at first. Her focus was on the case at hand, making sure that the process was carried out fairly and justly. But she was aware of the officer's presence and noticed how his attitude toward her seemed to grow more dismissive with each passing second. He muttered something under his breath, and the judge simply ignored it. But his disdain was starting to cross a line. The officer's gaze turned sharp, almost mocking as he began to act in a way that seemed more personal than professional. He was intentionally trying to provoke her, his demeanor becoming more brazen. He made several comments under his breath that the woman didn't catch right away, but it was clear he was trying to undermine her authority. At this point, most people in the room were starting to feel uneasy, sensing that something wasn't right. And then it happened. The officer crossed a line that no one could have predicted. He made an unexpected move that would change the course of the day forever, all because he underestimated the woman he was dealing with. What he didn't realize was that the woman he was mocking, the one he thought was nothing more than just another person in the room, was far more important than he could have ever imagined. But that realization would come too late. As the court session continued, the atmosphere grew tense. The woman, who had remained quiet despite the officer's attitude, began to notice his behavior becoming increasingly inappropriate. The officer, a man known for his arrogance and stubbornness, didn't seem to care that his conduct was unprofessional. His body language became more aggressive, and his eyes narrowed as if he were looking for any chance to challenge her. At first, it was small things, a sideways glance here, a chuckle there. But soon, it escalated. The officer, who had been walking around the courtroom to maintain security, began to make loud, unnecessary comments. His words weren't directed at anyone in particular, but seemed designed to be heard by the judge. His tone was mocking, and it was clear he wasn't going to let the fact that a black woman was in charge slip by unnoticed. He seemed to think he could act however he wanted, that his position gave him the power to do so. The woman, who had been calm and professional up until this point, felt a rising discomfort. She had worked for years to earn this position, had faced many obstacles along the way, and was not about to let anyone undermine her authority. She could sense his intentions, his attempt to provoke her, but she chose not to react immediately. She had learned over the years that staying composed was often the best way to handle people like him. But the officer wasn't done. The moment came when he crossed a line that nobody in the courtroom could ignore. As he walked by the woman's seat, he made a sudden, unexpected move. He reached out, grabbed her by the hair, and yanked it roughly. It was an act of humiliation, an attempt to degrade her in front of everyone. The entire room fell silent as gasps of shock filled the air. The officer didn't seem to think twice about it, his actions driven by his own personal biases and the belief that he could do whatever he wanted in this moment. The woman's head snapped back from the force, and the officer, without asking for permission or even considering the consequences of his actions, pulled out a pair of scissors from his belt. Without saying a word, he began to cut her hair. People in the courtroom watched in disbelief, unable to process what was happening. It was an outrageous, disrespectful act, one that no one could have imagined happening in a courtroom, let alone one led by a woman of such stature. Despite the humiliation and the shock of the moment, the woman stood still, her expression unreadable. She didn't flinch, didn't shout, and didn't let the officer see how much his actions were affecting her. Inside, she was a mix of anger and disbelief, but outwardly, she remained composed, her focus on maintaining control of the situation. The officer, however, seemed to think his actions were justified. He continued with his task, oblivious to the fact that he was crossing a serious boundary. He believed that his power and authority gave him the right to do whatever he pleased, not realizing that the person he was humiliating was far more important than he could ever imagine. In his mind, he was in control, but the reality was about to hit him like a brick wall. The moment he finished his action, he looked up with a smug expression, but the woman's next move would leave him stunned. The courtroom was still and tense, with everyone frozen in shock at what had just happened. The officer, oblivious to the weight of his actions, stood with a smug look on his face, having just completed the degrading task of cutting the woman's hair. For a moment, everything seemed to hang in the air, as if time itself had paused. The other people in the room were too stunned to speak, unsure of how to react to the situation. Some glanced nervously at each other, while others simply stared, wide-eyed, at the scene before them. But amidst this silence, the woman who had been targeted by the officer began to stir. Her mind raced, and in the brief moment of shock, she was already processing the situation. She was hurt, but it was a controlled, quiet hurt, one that came from being disrespected in a way that was deeply personal. Yet, even as her emotions churned beneath the surface, she didn't show it outwardly. She had worked too hard to reach this position, and she wasn't going to let one reckless individual strip her of her dignity. She knew the moment she remained calm, things would start to shift. While the officer stood there, unaware of the consequences of his actions, she quickly composed herself. The power she held in that courtroom was not just in her position as a judge, but in the way she carried herself. With a deep breath, she stood up from her seat. There was no dramatic display of anger, no loud outburst. Instead, she moved with purpose and poise, her every action exuding authority. The room went silent as she made her way toward the officer, who seemed to have no clue that his actions were about to come back to haunt him. He stood there with the scissors in his hand, still smiling to himself, perhaps thinking he had won some small victory in his mind. But what he didn't realize was that the real consequence was just beginning. When she reached him, the woman's voice broke the silence. Her words were steady, calm, and firm. She didn't shout, didn't make a scene, but everyone in the room could hear the weight of her authority. "You've just made a grave mistake," she said, her tone measured but unmistakably stern. "You don't understand who I am, but you will." At first, the officer seemed confused, as if he was still processing what had just been said. It wasn't clear to him yet that the woman he had humiliated was the very person in charge of the courtroom. His smirk faltered, and his gaze shifted, suddenly realizing something was very wrong. But it was too late for him to take back what he had done. His arrogance, his disrespect, had already pushed things too far. The room was still tense, but now there was a shift in energy. People looked at each other with widened eyes, realizing that they had just witnessed something monumental. They were beginning to understand the gravity of the situation. The officer was no longer in control, and the woman, despite everything that had just happened, was still calm, still in control. Her ability to remain composed in such a situation showed the strength of her character and the depth of her leadership. She knew the next steps. Her training, her years of experience, and her understanding of justice were now her guides. There was no hesitation. She called for the session to be paused and ordered the officer to leave the room. As he stood there, still processing, he realized that his actions had consequences far beyond what he had imagined. The judge had made her move, and there was no turning back now. The officer stood frozen for a moment, caught off guard by the judge's calm, commanding presence. He blinked, trying to make sense of what was happening. His mind raced as the words she had spoken echoed in his head. "You don't understand who I am, but you will." For the first time that day, he felt a flicker of uncertainty, though it wasn't enough to make him fully grasp the situation. He looked around the courtroom, sensing the change in the air. The room, which had been eerily quiet, was now charged with a quiet tension. The judge's expression remained firm, yet there was a quiet strength in her eyes that spoke volumes. She didn't need to raise her voice or make any threats. Her mere presence was enough to convey the seriousness of the moment. She hadn't lost control. If anything, she had only gained more. Her steady demeanor made it clear to everyone in the room that she was in charge. The officer's demeanor began to shift slightly. He looked over at the courtroom staff and the few attorneys present, as if seeking validation, but all he received were looks of disbelief, disappointment, and, in some cases, sympathy for the woman he had wronged. The judge remained unwavering in her composure, calling for the officer to leave the courtroom. Her request was simple but powerful. No one moved for a moment, unsure of how to react, but the officer seemed to take a long second to process the reality of the situation. He was still grasping the idea that he had just humiliated a woman in a courtroom, and now he was being told to leave. The weight of what had just happened was slowly starting to sink in, but it wasn't enough to erase the act from his memory. With reluctance, the officer took a step back. His arrogance had started to fade, replaced by a sense of shame and confusion. He had never thought this would be the outcome. He had thought that by taking the initiative and showing his power, he would be in control. But now, the situation had completely turned on him. The room was still silent, but the air was thick with the realization that what had happened wasn't just an isolated event. It was a reflection of something much deeper, something that transcended the events of that day. The woman, meanwhile, stood tall at the front of the room. She had always known the importance of staying composed, no matter what the situation. Her focus now was clear. This wasn't just about what had happened to her, it was about sending a message. She wanted to make sure that no one in that room, or anyone who would hear about this, would forget the lesson in what had just transpired. As the officer walked toward the door, the judge's gaze followed him, her expression unreadable, but her eyes sharp. There was no need for more words. Everyone in the room understood the power dynamic had shifted. The officer had lost his position of authority, and the judge had reclaimed hers. The room was still, as if waiting for something else to happen, but nothing more needed to be said. The officer left the courtroom, his departure a quiet acknowledgement of his mistake. The judge took a deep breath, her posture still unwavering. It was time to regain control of the court and continue with the session. But now, it wasn't just about the case at hand. It was about making a statement that would reverberate far beyond the walls of that courtroom. She had shown strength and resolve in the face of an attempt to undermine her. And as the room began to settle back into its usual rhythm, one thing was clear. The officer had made a fatal error in judgment, and the judge's power had never been more apparent. As the officer left the courtroom, the atmosphere shifted from tense silence to a quiet hum of disbelief. The weight of what had just happened hung in the air. For a few moments, no one moved, no one spoke. The judge, still standing at the front, took a deep breath, her composure returning as quickly as it had been disrupted. She had faced humiliation, But in that moment, she had reclaimed her dignity, her authority, and her control. She had chosen not to react in anger, but with calm, focused strength. And now, it was time to move forward, to address the situation as it truly deserved. She turned back toward the rest of the courtroom, her eyes scanning the room. The people present, attorneys, court staff, and the few remaining spectators, were still processing what they had witnessed. The shock was evident in their faces, but there was also a sense of respect for the judge that had grown in the silence following the officer's departure. Her calmness in the face of such a disrespectful act had left an impression on everyone. What had started as a shocking and disrespectful display of power from the officer had quickly been turned into an important lesson in grace, control, and justice. With a steady voice, the judge addressed the courtroom. "We will continue with this session," she said, her words clear and firm, yet devoid of any anger. She didn't need to raise her voice to make her authority known. Her words alone were enough to bring the room back to attention. "However, I will be addressing this matter further after today's proceedings. We must all understand the importance of respect and fairness in this courtroom, regardless of who is in charge." There was a sense of quiet agreement in the room. No one spoke out of turn, and no one dared to challenge her words. The judge's calm but firm manner had already set the tone for the rest of the day. She was still in control, and nothing could change that. It was a powerful reminder that true authority wasn't about force, but about grace and confidence in one's own position. As the session continued, the judge's focus remained unshaken. She went about her duties with the same professionalism she always had, never allowing the earlier incident to distract her from the work that needed to be done. There were cases to be heard, arguments to be made, and decisions to be rendered. Her commitment to justice remained at the forefront of her mind. Behind the scenes, the officer's actions were already being looked into. Word of the incident had quickly spread beyond the courtroom, and the local police department was under pressure to respond. It didn't take long for higher-ups to take notice. The officer's behavior had not only been inappropriate, but it was a direct violation of the standards expected from anyone working in law enforcement. What had started as an isolated moment of disrespect was now becoming a much larger issue. But the judge, though aware of the growing attention, did not let it cloud her focus. She was not in this for personal gain or to seek revenge. For her, this was about making a statement. She had been targeted by an individual who thought he could use his power to humiliate her, but instead, she had shown that true strength came from within. She had made it clear that no one, no matter their position, was above respect and fairness. As the day drew to a close, the judge knew that this incident would not be easily forgotten. But she also knew that it was a step in the right direction. She had stood her ground, and in doing so, had helped to remind everyone in that room, and anyone who would later hear about the incident, that justice and respect had to be the foundation of any courtroom. Her actions spoke louder than any words ever could, and they had set an example for everyone involved. The day after the incident in the courtroom, the news had already started to spread. It wasn't just the people who had been present in the courtroom who were talking about what had happened. Word had reached the local community, and even the broader town was buzzing with the story. The events of the day before had left an undeniable mark. And now, the judge's calm but powerful response was being discussed everywhere. People were both shocked by what had happened and deeply impressed by how she had handled the situation. While the community talked, the judge had already moved on from the incident. She wasn't interested in gossip or becoming the center of attention. She had a job to do, and she was determined to continue doing it with the same level of professionalism and integrity that had always guided her career. However, she knew that the events of the previous day couldn't just be brushed aside. Something needed to be done to address the officer's behavior, and she was not the type to let a situation like this go unresolved. Behind the scenes, the local police department had already begun an internal investigation into the officer's conduct. There were multiple complaints from witnesses who had seen what had happened in the courtroom. Everyone who had been there was aware that the officer's behavior was completely out of line. The officer himself, who had likely thought his actions would go unnoticed, was now feeling the weight of his mistake. The initial smugness he had felt after humiliating the judge was now replaced by doubt and anxiety. He knew that he had crossed a line, and now he was facing the consequences. The judge, meanwhile, had taken a few moments to reflect on the events, but she didn't dwell on them. Her mind was focused on something greater, the importance of maintaining the integrity of the justice system and ensuring that everyone, regardless of their background or position, was treated with respect. She had seen too many instances where people in positions of power had abused that power, and it was a lesson she had learned the hard way over the years. But now, with her actions the day before, she had made it clear that such behavior would not be tolerated in her courtroom. She was also aware that the case against the officer would be handled in due time. She didn't need to be the one to make sure that he faced the consequences of his actions. That was something for the authorities to sort out. However, she knew that the story would likely make its way to the press, and soon it wouldn't just be the local community that was watching. The officer's actions had left a stain on his reputation, and now the world would know what had happened. As for the judge, she had always been determined to be a role model for others. She understood the importance of showing strength and grace, and how one's actions could send a powerful message to everyone around them. She had taken that lesson to heart many years ago and had worked hard to earn the respect she had. And in this moment, when faced with someone trying to undermine her, she had shown that nothing, no amount of disrespect or hostility, would ever change the fact that she was in control of her own story. When the press began to pick up the story, it wasn't just the shocking nature of the officer's actions that made headlines. It was the judge's response. People all over the town, and even beyond, began to speak of her courage, her ability to remain composed, and the quiet strength she had shown in such a trying situation. It wasn't about seeking praise. It was about setting an example for others, showing that no one should ever be made to feel small or powerless, regardless of the situation. The community had begun to see her not just as a judge, but as a symbol of resilience. Through her example, they were reminded that true power lay in self-respect and in how we respond to challenges. And that lesson, one of dignity, strength, and the importance of standing up for what is right, was something that would remain in the hearts of everyone who had witnessed what had happened. As the days passed, the ripple effects of the incident continued to spread. The officer who had acted out of line was now facing scrutiny from all directions. Inside the police department, the investigation into his behavior moved quickly. His superiors were reviewing the events, interviewing witnesses, and going over all the evidence. The officer, once so confident in his power and authority, was now in the midst of an uncomfortable and humiliating process. He had never imagined that his actions would lead to such consequences. Meanwhile, the community continued to talk about what had happened. Most people were in awe of the judge's ability to handle the situation with such poise and dignity. Her calm response in the face of humiliation had earned her even more respect. People admired her not just for her position, but for the way she carried herself and stood her ground. Her actions had shown that true power wasn't about making others feel small. It was about standing up for what was right, no matter the cost. The judge, however, did not concern herself with the attention or praise she was receiving. She had always been focused on her work, her duty to justice, and the people who came before her in the courtroom. She had no time for distractions, and she certainly had no interest in using the situation to gain any kind of personal advantage. Her main concern was ensuring that the officer's actions were addressed appropriately so that this kind of behavior wouldn't happen again, not just in her courtroom, but anywhere. Behind the scenes, discussions were being held about the officer's future. Many in the department were calling for strict consequences, including possible suspension or termination. It was clear that his behavior had crossed a line, and the public was expecting nothing less than accountability. The officer, once so certain that he could act without consequence, now found himself at the mercy of a system he had once taken for granted. He had been humbled, and the very power he had tried to wield had come back to haunt him. The judge, as she continued to focus on her work, made it clear that her stance on the matter was unwavering. She wasn't interested in revenge, nor did she seek to escalate the situation. She wanted justice to take its course, and she trusted that the investigation would ensure the officer's actions would be dealt with fairly. In her eyes, the lesson was clear. No one was above respect, no matter their position or title. She hoped that by setting this example, others would see the importance of treating people with dignity, regardless of their race, gender, or status. As the officer's future hung in the balance, the community seemed to come together in support of the judge. Her actions had set a standard for how people should be treated, and many were inspired by the way she handled the ordeal. She had shown strength in a way that was not about physical power or authority, but about maintaining one's integrity and standing firm in the face of adversity. Her example was a powerful reminder that true leadership is about respect and fairness, and it wasn't something that could be undermined by anyone, no matter how high up they thought they were. Though the situation had caused a great deal of tension, it also sparked meaningful conversations about respect, power, and authority. It was a chance for the community to reflect on the importance of treating everyone fairly, regardless of their position in life. The judge's actions had not only made a statement about her personal strength, but about the values that should guide every interaction, especially in spaces like the courtroom, where justice is meant to be blind to all biases. In the end, the officer learned that power could be fleeting, and that respect was not something that could be demanded, it had to be earned. As for the judge, she continued to carry out her duties with the same professionalism she always had, but now her reputation had grown even stronger. She had become a symbol not just of justice, but of the power of grace under pressure. And that was something that would never be forgotten by those who had witnessed her strength. Weeks after the incident, the dust had begun to settle. The investigation into the officer's behavior was nearing its conclusion, and the community was waiting to see what the final outcome would be. The officer, who had once felt invincible, now found himself struggling with the reality of the consequences of his actions. The investigation had not been kind to him. Witnesses had testified to his inappropriate behavior in the courtroom, and the department had come under pressure to hold him accountable for his actions. He had lost much of the respect he had once commanded, and his reputation had taken a serious hit. But for the judge, life had returned to its usual rhythm. She continued to preside over her cases with the same level of commitment and professionalism she had always shown. The incident in the courtroom was still in the back of her mind, but she refused to let it define her or distract her from her work. Her focus remained on delivering justice to the people who came before her, and she knew that the way she handled the situation had sent a message far beyond the walls of the courtroom. She had shown that she would not tolerate disrespect, and her actions had reinforced the idea that no one was beyond accountability. As time passed, the officer faced the consequences of his actions. He was suspended from his position, while the department conducted further internal reviews. It wasn't long before his suspension was followed by a formal disciplinary hearing. The officer tried to defend his actions, claiming that he hadn't meant to disrespect anyone, but the evidence was clear. His conduct had been unprofessional, and he had crossed a line that could not be ignored. In the end, the officer was dismissed from his position. His actions had cost him his career, and his life would never be the same. While the officer's downfall was a clear consequence of his actions, the judge's reputation had only grown stronger. People respected her more than ever, not just for her position, but for the way she had handled herself with grace and dignity. She had taken a situation that could have easily escalated into something far more destructive and turned it into an opportunity to teach a powerful lesson about respect, integrity, and fairness. Her actions spoke louder than words, and she had earned the admiration of not just her colleagues, but of the community as a whole. The judge never sought out praise or recognition for what had happened. That was never her intention. For her, the outcome was about maintaining the integrity of the justice system and ensuring that people in her courtroom were treated with fairness and respect. She was more focused on the bigger picture, ensuring that the lessons learned from this incident would stay with people long after the details of the case have faded from public memory. In the end, the community had learned an important lesson. They had witnessed firsthand how one individual, standing firm in their principles, could create a ripple effect that brought about change. The judge's response had reminded everyone of the importance of standing up for what is right, even in the face of adversity. She had shown that power isn't about physical strength or intimidation. It's about the ability to maintain composure, show respect, and act with integrity, no matter the situation. The officer, on the other hand, had learned the hard way that actions have consequences. His attempt to undermine the judge's authority had not only failed, but it had cost him everything. It was a humbling experience, one that he would carry with him for the rest of his life. He had tried to use his position to exert power over someone else, but in doing so, he had lost everything that truly mattered: his career, his reputation, and the respect of those around him. As for the judge, she continued to serve with the same dedication she always had, knowing that her example had made a lasting impact. The lesson she had imparted, not just in her actions, but in the way she carried herself through the ordeal, would continue to resonate with everyone who had witnessed it. Her unwavering commitment to justice and respect was a reminder that true leadership comes from within, and that the most powerful way to inspire change is by leading with integrity.